My name is Maya Johnson, and I am 28 years old, and for as long as I can remember I have been the one my family blamed for everything, and last Tuesday my brother Marcus finally crossed the line, and I woke up in the emergency room barely able to breathe, and as I blinked against the blinding hospital lights, my ribs aching, and my head swimming with pain, my mother Lena leaned in over me, not with love or concern, but with a warning, and she whispered close to my ear, "Stay quiet, Maya, he has a future." And what she never expected was that my doctor, a woman named Dr. Reed, saw more than just my injury. She saw the old bruises, the patterns, and unlike my mother, she was not here to protect appearances, she was here to protect me. And what my mother did not know was that Dr. Reed was not just a doctor, she was a mandatory reporter, and she picked up the phone and made a call, and with that call she did more than start a police report. She pulled the first thread that would unravel a 10-year lie and uncover a $50 million inheritance that was rightfully mine. And as I lay on that hospital gurney, the bright lights flashing overhead, every beep of the heart monitor crashing into my ears like thunder, the pain in my ribs stealing the air from my lungs, I heard someone call out my name, Maya Johnson, 28-year-old female, blunt force trauma to the torso. And I tried to move, but every twitch of my body sent lightning bolts of pain down my side, and tears I did not even realize I was crying streaked down my face as a nurse hovered over me, speaking in a calm voice, "Maya, can you hear me? We are going to help with the pain now." And I tried to nod, but even that made the agony worse. And then the curtain was yanked open, and it was not the doctor, it was him, Marcus, perfect, as always, in a crisp tailored suit, his hair flawless, but his eyes wild, darting around the room like a man trapped. And he paced back and forth, hands in his hair, muttering, "Damn it, Maya, damn it," over and over again, not talking to me but to himself. And then she appeared, my mother Lena, the picture of Southern wealth and power, her pearls catching the light, her anger disguised as control, and she did not even glance at the machines. I was hooked up to her, eyes locked on Marcus, and she hissed, "How many times have I told you to control your temper? Do you know what you have done? The gala is on Friday. The mayor is coming." Marcus turned to her, panicked voice rising. "I did not mean to." She kept pushing me. She kept bringing up Jessica. "She knows how stressed I am." And he pointed at me like I was a broken lamp he had knocked over. And I tried to say his name to tell the truth, but all I could manage was a gasp. And that was when my mother finally looked at me, not with love but with contempt, and she said, "This is an embarrassment." And then the doctor arrived, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a calm voice. "I am Dr. Reed, and I need to examine my patient." And she stepped between them and looked at me and asked, "Maya, can you tell me what happened?" And before I could answer, Lena stepped forward, her tone changing instantly to fake concern. And she clutched her hands like she was praying and said, "Thank you, doctor. It was a horrible accident. My daughter has always been so clumsy. She fell down the stairs home." And Marcus nodded beside her, trying to look sincere. I tried to catch her. It all happened so fast. And Dr. Reed did not say anything right away. She just looked at me, then at Marcus's polished shoes, and then back at Lena's perfect face. And I knew from the way her eyes moved she did not believe it word of it. And I met her gaze and tried to speak, and I rasped, "No, he." And that was when my mother leaned in, brushing my hair, gently pretending to be affectionate, but her voice was ice when she whispered, "Stay quiet, Maya. He has a future. Do not ruin this for him." And then she straightened, smiling at the doctor, tears in her eyes. "She is in so much pain. Doctor, please help her." And later, when the trauma bay quieted and I was alone, the machines beeping softly, Dr. Reed returned, tablet in hand. She pulled a stool beside me, her face calm but focused, and said, "Maya, I have your results, and the good news is there is no internal bleeding, but the scans confirm 2 fractured ribs here and here." She turned the screen toward me, showing thin white cracks in my bones, "and a hairline fracture in your forearm." She added, "Your right ulna." And I stared at the screen, too stunned to speak. He really did this. And Dr. Reed continued, her tone steady, "I have been an ER doctor for 15 years, Maya. I have seen many stair falls, and yes, a wrist fracture from trying to catch yourself is normal. But these rib breaks, they are consistent with a single hard blow, not a tumble." And I just stared at the ceiling, at a brown water staying above me, and she gently took my arm, the one with the fracture, and pulled up the sleeve, revealing fading bruises, green and yellow in the shape of fingers, large fingers, and she said softly, "These are not new, Maya, these are weeks old," and I tried to pull my arm back, but she held it gently, not with judgment but with care, and she said, "Meyer, I am a mandatory reporter, and if I have reason to believe you are being abused, I am required to report it, and what your family told me does not match. These injuries and these bruises tell another story, and I want you to know I am not the police, I am your doctor, and my only concern is your safety. Please tell me what really happened." And for a long time I could not speak, because how could I explain that my mother had just threatened me, while pretending to care, that my brother, the rising star of Atlantis society, had done this to me, that they were lying to protect him. And Dr. Reed waited, and then she said, "I know the Johnson name, it is everywhere on this hospital, but that does not matter to me right now. You are my patient, and I believe you are in danger, and I need you to confirm what I already suspect." And I looked at her, this stranger who had shown more kindness than my family ever had, and I could not speak, but I gave the smallest nod, and she said, "Thank you, that is all I needed." And she stood and said, "I am going to get you something for the pain, and then I am going to contact the hospital social worker. We are going to help you, Maya. You are not alone." And just as she turned to leave, the door burst open again, and in came Lena and Marcus, this time all smiles and sweetness, and Lena carried a giant bouquet and rushed to my bedside. "Maya, baby, we were so worried they would not let us in." And Marcus followed with a giant teddy bear and said, "I am so sorry, Meyer, I should have caught you." And Dr. Reed stood back, arms crossed, saying nothing but watching everything, and Lena turned to her doctor. "Is she going to be we are just so terribly upset." And Dr. Reed said she has 2 broken ribs and a fractured wrist, and she will need to stay for observation. And Lena pressed her hand to her chest and said, "Thank goodness, we will cover all costs and give her the best care." And Marcus stepped up and said, "The Johnson family has always supported this hospital. We know you will treat her with the highest priority." And it was a clear threat, a reminder of the influence, but Dr. Reed only said she will receive the same excellent care as every patient, and she will also need to meet with our social worker. And Lena's smile twitched, and she said, "Is that really necessary? We are her family, we can care for her." But Dr. Reed stayed firm. "It is hospital policy to ensure a safe discharge, and I have already requested a visit." And she turned and left after giving me one last look. And once she was gone, Lena's mask dropped completely, and she walked to the bouquet, adjusting it, while whispering to Marcus, "She is suspicious, and this social worker thing is a problem." And Marcus said, "It is fine, she cannot prove anything, it is our word against hers." And he turned to me and said, "Maya, we were just playing around, you slipped, remember?" And Lena joined in, her voice syrupy, "You were running, and Marcus tried to stop you, and you both fell. It was awful, but we are so glad it was not worse." And then she moved the bouquet to block the door and said, "We are going to take care of you, Maya. You will come to our house to recover, and Jessica will help." And I knew then they wanted to isolate me and control the story. And Lena leaned down close and whispered again, "When the social worker comes, you will smile and tell her you are happy to go home." And I stared at the ceiling, the pain in my body, nothing compared to the weight of their betrayal. And then the door closed, and Lena looked down at me, not as a mother, but as a strategist, and said clearly, "The police will be back. Social worker will be back, and you will stick to the story. You fell. It was an accident. You were clumsy. Say it until you believe it." And I whispered back, "He broke my ribs. He pushed me." And she narrowed her eyes and said, "I do not care. If he threw you out a 3rd-floor window, you will not ruin this." And Marcus snapped, "Do you know what is at stake this week? The gala, the mayor, half the city. This is my whole future." And I said, "More important than me." And he shouted, "Yes, this is just broken bones, but you could ruin everything." And Lena stepped in, her voice cold, "Your brother is right. The foundation is our legacy, and you will not destroy it." And I laughed a broken, bitter sound and asked, "What am I supposed to be grateful for? The hand-me-downs, the community college, while he got everything?" And she leaned in, her voice sharp, "You are the disappointment, and even now you make it about you." And I shouted back, "I built my business, I pay my rent," while he was handed everything. And Marcus looked like he would hit me again, but Lena stopped him and said, "Here is what will happen. You will say you fell. You will go to our house until the gala is done, and if you speak out, I will say you had a breakdown. I will tell everyone you are unstable, and I asked who would they believe, and she said they will believe me because you have always been the problem, and her voice echoed in my mind, and I was no longer 28 and broken in a hospital. I was 16 and terrified, remembering the time Marcus shoved me and I broke a vase and Lena slapped me and said, "Why do you always make him angry?" And the past and the present folded into one, and I knew then they would do anything to protect him and everything to silence me, but this time they had no idea what was coming. An hour after Lena's final warning, the hospital room felt too quiet, too sterile, with only the steady beep of the monitor filling the silence, until there was a soft knock, and the door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with calm, intelligent eyes, dressed in a professional blouse and skirt, and beside her stood a uniformed police officer, and she introduced herself as Miss Fry, the hospital's social worker, and said, "This is Officer Miller. We are here to ask a few questions about the incident." And Lena stood immediately, shifting into her perfect mother act, hands clasped, face lined with deep concern, and said, "Thank goodness you are here. We are so worried. This has been so traumatic." And she turned to Marcus as if on cue, and he stepped forward, voice low and controlled, saying, "It was my fault, not exactly my fault, but we were just joking around at the top of the stairs like we always do." And she lost her balance. I tried to catch her, but it all happened so fast, and I watched as he pulled on that charming self-deprecating smile like a coat he had worn 100 times, and Lena picked up the story right where he left it, her tone hushed and motherly. Maya's always been so fragile, so emotional lately. She had a bad breakup and her work's been hard, and we have been concerned about her mental health. And honestly, we are worried this might not have been a simple accident, and I could barely believe what I was hearing, the way she wrapped her cruelty in concern. And Officer Miller nodded, writing in his notepad, while Miss Fry said, "I see," and then turned to me and asked softly, "Miss Johnson, can you confirm that version? Did you fall?" And I felt the pressure in the room like a weight. Lena standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes drilling into mine, and I opened my mouth, but nothing came out until the door opened again, and Dr. Reed stepped in like a storm in a lab coat and said, "I am sorry to interrupt, but we need to pause this visit. Maya just started a new pain protocol, and she needs rest." And when the officer tried to argue, Dr. Reed turned to Lena, her tone clipped and professional, and said, "This conversation will resume only after a private consultation, as required by our discharge protocol for domestic injuries." And Lena tried to protest, but Dr. Reid was unshakable and said, "Please wait in the family lounge, and we will inform you when the consultation is complete." And with that, she escorted Marcus and Lena out, and the door shut behind them, and Officer Miller turned to Miss Fry and said, "I will leave you to it. Let me know if anything needs documenting." And he stepped out too, and the room went still, and Miss Fry pulled her chair close, her demeanor shifting from neutral to gentle support, and Dr. Reed stood at the foot of my bed, her arms crossed, and said quietly, "They are gone, you are safe, and I cannot force you to say anything, but I want you to know I believe you." And Miss Fry nodded and added, "Maya, your family painted you as unstable and clumsy. That is a classic tactic used by abusers. They are building a narrative to discredit you before you speak, and we see it every day, but we need to hear your voice. Are they lying?" And I felt the tears rise, and finally I whispered I did not fall, and Dr. Reid closed her eyes in grim confirmation and walked to the wall phone and called security. "This is Dr. Reid on floor 3, patient room 305. I am placing a no visitor restriction on this room, effective immediately. And that includes Lena Johnson and Marcus Johnson. Yes, I will sign the order." And she turned to me and said, "That is step 1 now. Tell it everything." And I nodded and took a shaky breath and said, "It is not just my word, I have proof." And I asked Miss Fry to get my purse, and she pulled out my phone, and I told her the password is 1215, and the app looks like a calculator called insurance, and when she entered it, it opened to a secret cloud drive full of folders, and she looked stunned. There were photos, audio files, screenshots, and I said, "Open the photo folder," and she did, scrolling through dozens of time-stamped images. And I began to explain, "This one, May 10th, my birthday, Marcus got mad because our aunt sent me a gift and not him, and he left this bruise on my shoulder shaped exactly like his hand, and this one from August 2nd, when he threw a heavy book at me, and I blocked it and sprained my wrist, and my mother told me to wear long sleeves until it healed, and Miss Fry scrolled through 15 photos taken over 12 months, and then I said, now open the audio folder and the one labeled The Parasite, and she gave me a questioning look and I nodded, and she pressed play and the room filled with the sound of Marcus's voice snarling, "You think you are better than me, you are a parasite living in my house," and I flinched at the sound even though I knew it was coming, and then my own voice, small and scared, asking him to turn the music down because I had a client call, and he screamed, "I run this family, I feed you, I clothe you, I can destroy you," and then something heavy smashed, and Miss Fry quickly stopped the recording, her face pale, and Dr. Reed looked shaken, and I whispered, "That was last month. He broke our grandmother's antique mirror and my mother blamed me and took the money from my paycheck." And then I said, "There is one more, the text folder, the file called The Bribe," and Miss Fry opened it and saw a screenshot of messages, me sending a photo of my bruises saying he hurt me, and my mother replying, "Delete that photo now, you know how important this merger is, do not ruin it." And I responded, "He scared me," and she answered, "Stop it, Maya, just be a good sister, delete the photo, and I will add $500 to your allowance." And for a moment the room was silent, and Dr. Reed finally said, "This is not an isolated incident, this is organized long-term abuse. And your mother is not just enabling it, she is paying to cover it up." And Miss Fry nodded, "This folder changes everything, this is not just your word against theirs, this is undeniable proof." And I asked, "What do we do?" And Miss Fry said, "First, I am uploading all of this to a secure server and contacting the domestic violence unit." And Dr. Reed said, "And I will add it to your medical file, and Lena can explain these texts in court." And Miss Fry made the call, her voice steady. "Yes, we have a high-threat domestic abuse case with documented proof. Yes, photos, audio, text messages. I need emergency protective orders." And she hung up and said, "Next, we get you a lawyer, a real one, David Sterling, he is the best." And at 4 o'clock, the restraining order was served at the Johnson estate. Marcus was drinking whiskey, hands shaking. Lena was arguing with the gala caterer, and when the server handed Marcus the documents, his face turned purple, and he screamed, "They cannot do this," and Lena read the order, cold fury in her eyes, and said, "A temporary protective order banning us from our daughter," and she called their lawyer immediately. "Jonathan, we have a problem. My daughter is unstable. She has been manipulated by a doctor at the hospital," and Marcus paced and yelled, "She is trying to ruin me after everything I gave her," and Lena hushed him and said, "We need this order thrown out, and we need it fast. Claim she is a danger to herself," and the doctor coerced her. "I do not care how, do it," and she hung up and said, "She is weak, she just needs to remember who has the power." And Marcus asked, "How do we get to her if we are banned?" and Lena smiled and said, "We are not on the list, but your wife is." And the next day, while security kept Lena and Marcus away, I watched them argue through the glass until they left, and I thought I could finally breathe, but an hour later the door opened, and a woman with a bright voice walked in saying, "I am Jessica, his wife, just here to visit," and the guard hesitated and let her in, and she came in with a fancy gift basket full of expensive teas and lotions, and said, "Maya, darling, I came as soon as I heard," and she fussed over the water pitcher, saying, "We must get you some proper Fiji water." And I said quietly, "Jessica, I am tired, I do not feel like visitors," and her face changed completely, the sweet act gone, and she hissed, "Listen, you brat, I do not know what game you are playing, but you are going to stop it. And you will tell the lawyer and doctor that you are confused, and you are going to go home and fall in line." And I whispered, "Jessica, he broke my ribs," and she rolled her eyes and said, "Oh, boo, who, and you are ruining his life. Do you know how hard he worked for this gala, this future? And now you want to destroy it." And she stepped closer, filled with rage. "He is meeting the mayor, this is our legacy, and you are turning us into a scandal." And I whispered again, "He assaulted me," and she snapped, "He is under pressure, and you provoked him, you always do, you are jealous of him. And you always have been, you are a parasite." And the word echoed in my mind, and I found strength and said, "I am not living off anyone, I run my own design business, I own my condo, and I pay rent for that room in Lena's house." And she looked surprised, then laughed a mean, cold sound, and said, "Your little business, your little condo, that is not real money. The Johnson Empire is worth $50 million, and it belongs to the legacy, and you are not part of it, and I said it was my grandfather's company, and she said he gave it to Marcus because he knew who was worthy, and then she froze, realizing what she said, and quickly changed her tone. Look, just stop this call off the lawyers, be a good girl, and do not make us crush you, because we will. And she turned to leave, then paused at the door and said, by the way, those bruises clash horribly with your skin tone, and slammed the door. And I stared at the space she left in her wake, the smell of her perfume hanging in the air, and the only thing echoing in my mind were her words, he gave it to Marcus, not you. And I repeated it over and over, not you, not you. And I pressed the call button. I needed my phone. I needed to call my lawyer now. Jessica's final words rang in my mind long after she left, her voice coated in disdain, her insult dressed as advice, and I stared at the door she had slammed, her exit as loud as her threats, but all I could think about was that one slip, the way she said he gave it to Marcus, not you, and the phrasing felt wrong, like she had said more than she meant, and the way it stuck in my brain made me hit the nurse call button. I need my phone, I whispered when the nurse arrived, and she nodded and brought it to me. And with trembling fingers I called David Sterling, the attorney Miss Fry had connected me with, and he picked up on the second ring and said, David Sterling speaking. And I said, David, this is Maya Johnson. We spoke yesterday with Miss Fry. And he responded, yes, Miss Johnson, I filed the motion for extended protective orders. How are you feeling? And I said, I am okay, but something happened. My sister-in-law got past security, and she was here. And he asked sharply, did she threaten you? And I said yes, but that is not the biggest part. She said something strange. She said he gave it to Marcus, not you. And I asked what that could mean. And there was silence on the line, and I thought we lost connection. Until he said slowly, Maya, that is a very particular phrase. It suggests there was a decision, a comparison, a choice between you and Marcus. And I said, but there was no choice. The company went to my father, and then to Marcus, and I was never part of that conversation. And David said that is what they told you, but narratives can be written and rewritten, and people like Lena and Marcus, they craft stories. And that line she let slip might be the key to what they have been hiding. And I asked, what does it mean? And he said, I am going to Fulton County Probate Court tomorrow morning. The original will is public record, and they may have filed amendments or tried to bury it, but they cannot hide the first version, not from me. And I asked, what are you looking for? And he said simply, your name and the truth. And after we hung up, I held the phone to my chest and stared out the hospital window as the Atlanta skyline blurred in the distance. And over the next 2 days everything moved in pieces. I was transferred to a regular room, my ribs still wrapped tight, my wrist now in a cast, and the security guard remained stationed outside my door, a silent sentry. And I met my physical therapist, Tasha, who was blunt and kind, and said, we need to keep your lungs working so pneumonia does not set in. And she handed me a plastic breathing device and said, inhale. And I tried, but the pain was searing, and I gasped, I cannot. And she said, yes, you can. You are not helpless anymore, Maya. You are in control. And while I forced air through shattered bones, David Sterling was unraveling a decade-old lie. I imagined him in court halls, thumbing through dusty files, piecing together the real story. And on the third day, while Tasha had me sitting upright in the hospital chair, for the first time my phone rang, and I saw his name, and picked up with shaking hands, and he said, Meyer, I have it. I am standing in the probate archive, and I found your grandfather's will signed and notarized on March 15th, 2010, 6 months before he died. And I asked, what does it say? And David's voice changed into something quiet and intense. And he said, it is clear and specific. Elijah Johnson, being of sound mind, divided his main asset, Johnson Construction, equally between his grandchildren, 50% to Marcus Johnson and 50% to Maya Johnson. And I dropped the phone. It landed in my lap, and I just stared. 50% not penny less. I was not the outsider, not the extra. I had been a co-owner since I was 18 years old. And I picked up the phone again and whispered, I am here. And David said, Maya, that is not even the best part. Your grandfather was brilliant. He knew his family. And he included a clause, Article 4, Section B, the morality clause, and it says if either beneficiary is convicted of a felony crime involving violence, fraud, or moral turpitude, they forfeit their entire 50% share, and it transfers in full to the other beneficiary. And he paused to let the words settle. Maya, do you understand? What that means and I could not answer. I just sat frozen as my thoughts crashed together because Marcus had assaulted me, and Lena had tried to cover it, and if he is convicted, he loses everything, and it all becomes mine. And David repeated, Meyer, are you there? And I said, yes, I understand now. Press charges, all of them, and I hung up and sat in the still hospital room, the beep of machines steady and soft, the lights buzzing faintly. And I looked at the guard at the door, a man placed there because Dr. Reed believed in me. And I picked up the phone again and dialed David one more time, and I said, press the charges and make it public. And the next morning, Lena, Marcus, and their attorney, Jonathan, entered the hospital conference room, all of them calm, and polished, their faces arranged into concern and strategy. And I was seated in a wheelchair arm, in a purple cast ribs, bound and hidden under a soft sweater. David sat beside me, confident and quiet. And Jonathan opened his folder and said, Maya, we are here to offer help. Your family is worried and concerned, and they want to support your recovery. And Lena leaned in, smiling like a loving mother, and said, we have a beautiful retreat in Florida where you can rest and heal, and we will take care of all your expenses. And Jonathan added, a generous monthly allowance will be provided, so you can focus on getting better, and in return, we just need you to sign a small statement clarifying that this was all a misunderstanding brought on by stress and medication, and that what happened was a simple fall. And Marcus finally spoke, his voice low and serious. Meyer, I have apologized, and we need to move past this. The gala is falling apart. And I looked at the paper he slid to me, a formal statement that called me confused and paranoid, that painted Dr. Reed as overreaching and described my injuries as accidental. And I looked at David and asked, what is your opinion of this offer? And he smiled and said, it is very generous, but Miss Johnson and I decline. And Lena's smile cracked, and Jonathan said, wait, let us not be hasty. And David said, actually, we have a counter offer. And he placed a thick folder on the table and said, this is the original notarized will of Elijah Johnson, filed March 15th, 2010. And I watched the color drain from Lena's face, and Marcus froze his eyes wide, and Jonathan said, I do not understand. And David explained, your grandfather did not leave the company to your father. He split it between Marcus and Meyer. And Lena whispered, that is not possible. And David said, it is not only possible, it is proven. And he flipped to the final page and said, and this is Article 4, Section B, the morality clause, and he read it slowly. If either Marcus or Meyer is convicted of a felony crime involving violence or fraud, their entire share is forfeited and given to the other. And Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his face pale, and I looked at Lena and said, all my life you called me a parasite. You bribed me with $500 of my own money to keep quiet, and you told everyone I was unstable because you were afraid that if I ever found out the truth you would lose everything. And Marcus yelled, this is slander. And David said, we also have audio of you threatening her and text messages from Lena covering it up, and the felony charge will be filed today. And Lena tried to recover her composure and said, this is a mistake. But I said that night in the emergency room, when you whispered, he has a future, you were not talking about your love for him. You were talking about your own access to his $25 million, and now that is gone. And David closed the file and said, it is time to discuss Maya's full ownership. And in that moment I knew I was not the outsider, I was the legacy, and everything they had tried to steal was already mine. The ballroom of the Atlanta Regency glittered like something from a dream, drenched in money and pride, and the air was thick with perfume and polite power. And under the crystal chandeliers, the city's most influential black elite moved in tailored tuxedos and satin gowns, swirling champagne in crystal glasses, while a jazz quartet played softly in the corner. But behind the polished surface, the tension was invisible to most because they did not know that both Lena and Marcus were out on bail, both standing on stage smiling like royalty, as if their entire world was not about to fall apart. Lena, in an emerald green gown, looked flawless, her pearls reflecting the light, her face composed like a queen delivering a sermon, and Marcus beside her was a picture of success in a sharp tuxedo, as he addressed the crowd with humble gratitude. Thank you to our mayor, to our donors, and to our community And he spoke of legacy, of how Johnson Construction was built on red Georgia clay and hard work, and how they now carried that dream forward. But what no one knew was that the woman they had erased, the woman they tried to silence, was about to reclaim everything. And just as Marcus said the word, weather any storm, the ballroom doors opened and every head turned, and the sound of the wheelchair wheels rolling over the carp. It was quiet but deafening, and there I was pushed by Dr. Reed, wearing a deep blue dress with my broken arm in a black sling, my hair pulled back and my posture tall and proud. And the crowd froze, some whispering, others gasping, and on stage Lena's mask cracked, and Marcus's face turned pale and tight, and he leaned into the microphone, his voice no longer polished but low and threatening. "What is the meaning of this security?" And Dr. Reed stepped forward, calmly, "No need. Security, my patient, Miss Maya Johnson, is a 50% owner of Johnson Construction, and I believe she has the right to attend her own gala." And the whispers turned to stunned silence, and I rolled forward, my gaze steady, my voice clear. "I am Maya Johnson, and as the co-owner of the company behind this event, I believe I have every right to be here." And the gasps rippled across the crowd, and the mayor leaned to Pastor Brown whispering, and Lena looked like she had seen a ghost, and Marcus hissed, "She is lying, she is delusional." And I replied, "Am I?" And then I turned to Lena and said, "Since this event is about family and legacy, I would like to say a few words." And the pressure in the room made it impossible for them to refuse, so Lena nodded a shaky yes, and Dr. Reed pushed my chair up the ramp, and I took the microphone, my hand without the cast steady, and I said, "Thank you for being here, supporting the Johnson Foundation. My name is Maya Johnson, and my family has told many people that I am unstable, that I fell down the stairs, that I needed to be sent away to rest, but lies built on fear tend to crack, and tonight I will show you the truth." And I nodded to the technician David Sterling had hired, and the screen behind us went dark and then lit up with security footage, not of a hospital or staircase, but of my office in the Johnson Construction building, dated October 14th, 2 days before the incident. And the footage showed me packing a box at my desk, and Marcus bursting in, angry, yelling, waving his arms, and the room saw him shout and throw my phone against the wall, and then reach for me and shove me hard, and my body hitting the desk, the sound of ribs breaking loud and awful. And then Lena entering the office, not to help me, but to scold Marcus and say, "What were you thinking?" right here in the office. And the video cut to black, and no one in the room moved for 10 seconds, not a sound, just silence heavy with revelation. And Pastor Brown took off his glasses and closed his eyes, and then I spoke again. "That footage shows what they did to me, but it also shows what they tried to hide." And I reached into the side of my chair and pulled out a printed copy of the will David had retrieved, and I held it up and said, "This is the original will of Elijah Johnson, dated March 15th, 2010, and in it he names me and Marcus as equal beneficiaries, 50% each." In the room gasped again, and I said, "But that is not all. There is a morality clause that says if one of us commits a felony involving violence or fraud, they lose their entire share, and it goes to the other." And Marcus turned red and shouted, "That is not true." And David stepped forward from the side of the room and said, "It is very real and verified by the Fulton County Court, and we have filed charges as of this morning." And Lena looked like she would faint, but I kept going. I said, "All my life I was told I was the disappointment, the extra one, the unstable one, and it was never true. They needed me to believe it, so I would never question the money, the control, the silence." And I looked at the guests, all of them stunned, and said I was not a parasite, I was an owner, and everything they did was to keep me from finding out. But now the truth is here, and everyone in this room will see it, and there is no going back. The moment the final video clip faded to black, the silence was unbearable, so loud it pressed on every chest in the ballroom like a weight, and I could feel the temperature of the room change, as if the lies that once warmed it had been stripped away, leaving only the cold, sharp truth. And for several seconds there was no movement, only the frozen expressions of Atlanta's most powerful faces staring at the screen. And then slowly, almost like a wave, the whispers began traveling from one table to another, and I watched the donors shift uncomfortably in their seats, whispering to assistants, trying to process what they had just witnessed, and executives clutched their champagne glasses with white knuckles, and reporters, who had been invited to cover the charity angle, began discreetly recording and taking notes, because they knew a different headline had just been born, one far more explosive than any fundraising milestone. And at the front of the stage my mother stood still, but her hands trembled slightly against her dress, and Marcus no longer had the confidence he had carried just minutes earlier. Instead, his mouth hung open, his breathing quick and uneven, and when he finally spoke his voice cracked. "She is lying. She edited the footage. This is a setup." And his voice echoed across the hall, but there was no weight in it any more. The trust had shattered, and I did not even flinch. I raised the microphone and looked him in the eye and said, "The only thing more dangerous than a lie is believing it will never be exposed." And before he could respond, Dr. Reed stepped forward, her presence calm and authoritative, and said, "I am the physician who treated Maya Johnson, and I documented her injuries, including 3 fractured ribs, a broken arm, and bruising consistent with blunt force trauma, and I made a report, and I stand by it." And her voice did not shake, and the crowd took a breath as her words slammed into the false narrative that had been carefully crafted over years. And then David walked to the front holding a manila folder and said, "For those of you who need evidence in your hands, I have filed certified copies of Elijah Johnson's original will and the updated share agreements with the Fulton County Probate Court, and these documents confirm that Meyer is a legal 50% owner, and due to the morality clause in the agreement, Marcus Johnson's rights to his share have been suspended pending a criminal investigation." And the mention of suspended rights spread across the audience like a fire, because now they were not watching a scandal, they were watching a collapse. And several major donors stood up and walked out without a word, and Lena turned to them calling out, "Wait, please let us explain," and no one answered. And I spoke again saying, "All of you have supported this company because you believed in its values, in its legacy, but legacy is not built on lies and intimidation, and tonight you learned that my brother broke my ribs, and my mother told me to stay quiet because he had a future. But what about mine, and what about yours, and what about every girl who is told that her pain is less important than a man's potential?" And a woman in the crowd burst into tears, and her husband held her hand, and several young women looked at each other with silent understanding. And I said, "I am not here to destroy what Elijah Johnson built. I am here to protect it from those who thought it belonged only to them." And the crowd clapped hesitantly at first, then louder, not because they fully understood, but because they finally felt the weight of the truth. And Lena stepped forward, grabbing the microphone, her voice shaking with desperation, saying, "This is a family matter. You do not know the full story." And I turned my chair toward her slowly and replied, "I know enough, and now so does everyone else." And that was the end of their control, because no matter what they said or tried to spin the footage, the medical files, the legal documents had all spoken louder and clearer than any fabricated tale ever could. And Marcus tried to leave, but security stopped him and whispered that the police had already been notified and would arrive shortly, and he stood frozen, caught between pride and panic. And Lena sat down hard in the nearest chair. Her body slumped, her spirit cracked, and I remained still, but inside me the storm had cleared, and something strong had taken its place, and the reporters approached cautiously, but David stepped in and guided them to a corner where statements could be taken without turning the ballroom into a press circus. And Dr. Reed stayed close, her hand steady on my shoulder, while the jazz band tried to resume playing a tune that no longer fit the mood of the night. And as the lights above dimmed, I rolled myself off the stage without drama, without anger, just truth, and people moved aside, not in pity, but in respect, and I felt every step of that movement as a kind of reckoning, not just for me, but for every part of my past they tried to bury. And once outside, under the sharp, clean night sky, I looked up and whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa." And I knew he would have been proud of what I did, not because I won, but because I spoke, because I refused to be silent, and because in a world that told me to stay quiet, I dared to be louder than them all. The days that followed were a whirlwind of headlines, calls, emails, and the kind of attention I had spent years avoiding, and I found myself at the center of a media storm that never seemed to sleep. And the video from the gala spread like wildfire across every platform and news station, from local outlets to national networks, and suddenly My face was on screens and in articles, and strangers were calling me brave and powerful and a survivor. And some even called me a hero. And it felt surreal because I never saw myself that way. I had not spoken to be seen. I had spoken because silence had become too heavy to carry, and while part of me wanted to curl up and hide, the stronger part stood up because I knew that if I disappeared now, their narrative would try to grow back again, and I refused to give them that space. And the morning after the gala, I received a call from the district attorney's office asking me to come in for an official statement, and David drove me downtown and sat beside me while I recounted everything once again from the first slap to the last fracture. And I did not cry and I did not stutter, and when the assistant DA looked at me with quiet respect and said, "We will pursue the full extent of charges," I felt a piece of the old weight lift from my chest. And when we stepped back into the hallway, reporters were waiting, but David shielded me with his arm and guided me through the questions without stopping. And back at my apartment, I found flowers and cards at my doorstep, some from people I barely knew and others from complete strangers who had seen the video and just wanted me to know I was not alone. And I kept each one not out of vanity, but out of gratitude, because for so long I thought no one would ever believe me, and now they did. And I was scheduled to appear on 2 daytime talk shows and offered an interview with a major magazine, and I declined most of them, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to choose my words carefully. And when I finally sat down for an exclusive segment with a female journalist known for her integrity, I told the story not as a headline, but as a lived truth. And when she asked me what gave me the strength to speak, I said the silence had started to sound like my mother's voice, and I could not let that be the last thing I remembered. And the segment aired 2 days later and received millions of views and even more messages, and I read every single one and cried over many, because pain recognized pain, and my story had become a mirror for others, and that meant more than I could ever explain. And meanwhile the legal side moved quickly because the evidence was overwhelming, and Lena had no idea how fast her foundation would unravel once the donors pulled out. And the board of directors of the Johnson Foundation held an emergency meeting and voted to place her on administrative leave pending investigation. And Marcus's arrest made the evening news, and his mugshot trended for 3 days straight. And while I knew justice was not a straight road, the accountability had begun, and that was enough for now. And the following week, David invited me to a meeting with Elijah Johnson's former attorney, a man who had worked with my grandfather for over 3 decades, and he handed me a sealed envelope and said, "Elijah asked me to give you this when the time was right," and my hands shook slightly as I opened it, and inside was a handwritten letter dated 2 weeks before his passing. And it said, "Meyer, I know the truth will take time to surface, and when it does you may find yourself alone, but remember, I saw you. I believed you, and I never doubted your strength, not even once." And tears slid down my cheeks as I folded the letter and pressed it to my chest, and David placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and said, "Your grandfather always trusted you more than anyone else, and now the board is starting to see why." And over the next few days I was invited to sit in on company meetings and given access to reports and financials, and I met with department heads and legal teams, and slowly the company that once shut me out began to open its doors, because it was no longer about inheritance, it was about credibility and leadership. And even people who had once dismissed me now looked to me for guidance, and I did not let it go to my head. I let it settle in my bones like armor. And I responded to every email, every concern, every request, because I knew how much had been taken from me, and I refused to let power make me careless. And then one afternoon, while reviewing records, I came across a document flagged for internal review, and it was a line item related to a side account with funds that had been transferred repeatedly between shelf foundations, one of which was under Lena's name, and I felt my stomach twist as I traced the trail and realized she had been funneling donations meant for community programs into private investments. And I showed David, who immediately called a forensic accountant, and the fallout was swift and brutal, and the foundation's reputation suffered another blow. But for once it was not my word against theirs, it was numbers, dates, bank records, and every time someone tried to challenge me, I pointed to the paper and said, "This is what truth looks like when no one is listening, and this is what silence protects." And in the middle of it all, I received a voicemail from Marcus, a long, rambling message filled with rage and regret and begging and threats and apologies, and I deleted it without listening twice. And when Lena emailed me asking for a private meeting, I agreed, but only on my terms, and I chose a neutral location with witnesses. And when we sat across from each other, I saw a version of my mother I had never seen before, smaller, somehow faded, and she said I did what I thought was right for our family, and I replied, no, you did what was convenient, and you mistook convenience for care. And when she said I never stopped loving you, I said then you should have protected me. She had no reply, and that was the last time we ever spoke, and I walked out of that meeting not with closure, but with choice, and that was more valuable than any apology, because I had reclaimed the right to decide who had access to me, and who did not, and I went home and sat in my living room, surrounded by silence, but this time it was mine, and it was peaceful not because the world was quiet, but because I was no longer afraid to hear myself think. The first time I walked into the Johnson Foundation boardroom as a recognized legal owner, I felt every eye shift to me, not just out of curiosity, but from the weight of everything that had changed in such a short time, and I moved slowly not because of my injuries, but because I wanted each step to remind them that I was still standing, still breathing, still here, despite everything they did to silence me. And the boardroom smelled like fresh polish and expensive leather, just like I remembered from when I was a child hiding behind my grandfather's chair while he ran meetings and made decisions that built legacies. And now it was my seat and my decision and my legacy to protect. And the chairman cleared his throat and welcomed me with careful words, and I nodded not out of politeness, but because I knew words meant little without action, and he motioned to the seat at the far end, and I took it, letting my hands rest firmly on the table, while I looked around at the faces of men and women who had once dismissed me as broken or unfit or inconvenient, and I began by saying thank you for convening on short notice. I know this is unusual, but then again so is surviving the kind of betrayal that nearly cost me my life. And silence fell across the room because no one wanted to be the first to respond to something that honest, and I continued the financial audit. It revealed clear misappropriation of funds, and Lena Johnson used her position to benefit her private ventures, including multiple foundations that were not disclosed to the board, and the evidence was presented in files David had prepared, and no one questioned it because the signatures, dates, and transfers were too precise to ignore, and I laid out a clear plan to restructure the foundation's oversight process, to install third-party audits and establish a whistleblower protection policy so that no one else would feel the fear I once did. And I looked directly at the woman from legal who had once told me to be careful about accusations. And I said, I will not apologize for surviving. I will not apologize for being right, and I certainly will not apologize for demanding better. And she lowered her gaze and nodded. And when the chairman finally spoke again, he said, we support this direction, and the board will move to ratify your proposals immediately. And in that moment, I realized I had stopped asking for permission, started taking up space, and in the days that followed, I focused not just on rebuilding the foundation, but on building myself a new life, one not rooted in fear or revenge, but in freedom. And I returned to physical therapy sessions where my body ached with every stretch and every lift, but I kept going. Because healing was not a destination, it was a discipline, and I woke up every morning and reminded myself that strength was not the absence of pain, it was the refusal to let pain win. And David and I spent long hours reviewing grant programs and outreach plans, and we developed a new initiative in my grandfather's name to fund shelters for survivors of domestic violence, and we visited 3 locations in the first week. And each time I stepped inside a shelter, I saw eyes that mirrored the fear I once knew, but also the spark I had rediscovered. And one woman clutched my hand and whispered I thought no one would ever believe me, and I squeezed her hand and said, I know that feeling, and you are not alone. And back at the office I met with junior staff members, many of whom had never seen Marcus or Lena except in official emails, and they asked about my plans, and I said I want this foundation to be more than a name. I want it to be a place where people believe in their work, because their work believes in people. And that was the first time I saw real pride flicker behind those tired eyes, because belief is contagious, and it spreads faster than fear when nurtured properly. And I created a new scholarship fund in memory of my grandfather, but also in memory of every girl who had to walk into courtrooms with broken ribs and bruised spirits, and still find the courage to speak. And one morning, after a long meeting, I sat alone in my office staring out the window when a knock came at the door, and Dr. Reed stepped in holding a file and said, "I thought you might want to see this," and I opened it, and inside were thank you letters from patients she had treated since the gala who had come forward after seeing my story, and one was from a young boy whose sister had hidden her injuries for years. And she finally spoke because she heard that someone else survived, and I felt the tears rise again, and I let them fall because they were not weakness, they were proof. And Dr. Reed sat across from me and said, "I know this is hard, but I want you to know you changed something not just here, but everywhere." And that mattered more than any board vote or press headline. And in the quiet hours of night, when I lay in bed with the city noise humming below, I sometimes thought about Marcus and where he was and what he told himself to sleep, and I realized I did not need to know, because forgiveness was not required to move on, and some pain does not deserve closure, it just needs distance. And I stopped asking why and started asking what now, and I donated half of my personal inheritance to rebuild the community center my grandfather loved, and I stood at its reopening next to the mural of him and placed my hand on the painted outline of his and said, "We are still building," and I meant every word. And I received a letter one morning in crisp legal paper from Lena, and it said, "I hope one day you understand why I did what I did," and I tore it in half, not out of anger, but because her reasons no longer held power over my peace, and peace had become my compass, not revenge, not justice, just peace, and that was enough for me. And on the 1-year anniversary of the gala, David and I hosted a quiet dinner for the shelter directors and volunteers, and we served food ourselves and poured water and listened their stories and laughed together and shared silence, and I felt something sacred in that moment, something whole and unshattered. And later that night, as I walked the city streets alone, feeling the wind against my skin, I paused at the corner where I used to wait for the bus as a teenager, clutching a textbook and hiding bruises under my sleeves, and I looked at the same streetlight and whispered, "You made it," and I smiled not for anyone else, but for the girl I used to be, because she had waited long enough for someone to come, and I finally showed up. After the dinner with the shelter directors, I returned to the office with a different kind of focus, not just to manage the legacy left behind by my grandfather, but to build something that felt like mine, something that could not be stolen or rewritten. And the days grew busier than ever, and I did not mind, because the work became my rhythm, and the routine gave me peace, and I surrounded myself with people who saw me not as a victim, but as a leader, and every department slowly started to shift under that energy. And I hosted open floor meetings where no one had to wear a tie or present a slide deck, and people began speaking up, suggesting new outreach ideas, pitching community projects, and it was strange how something so small like being heard could completely change a workplace. And I received letters from survivors across the country, some handwritten, some typed, some scribbled in broken sentences, but all of them shared one common thread. They thanked me for making it through, for speaking when I could have disappeared. And one girl wrote, "I used to think pain was permanent, but then I saw your story and I cried reading that, not out of sadness, but out of the weight of how many lives were waiting for permission to heal." And Dr. Reid became not just my physician, but a close friend, and we began working together to establish a mobile clinic initiative that would offer medical care and trauma support in underserved areas. And we launched the pilot in a small rural town, 2 hours outside the city, and the first day we arrived, a line had already formed before the sun rose, and I walked the line, greeting each person with a nod or a handshake. And one elderly man grabbed my hand and said, "I remember your grandfather. He gave my brother a job, and that job saved our family." And I felt something swell in my chest, because legacy is not just what you leave behind in bank accounts, it is what you leave behind in people. And I started keeping a journal, not for legal records, not for strategy, but for myself, a place to put the thoughts that felt too heavy to carry. And I wrote about dreams and fears and the moments I still woke up gasping from the echo of broken bones, and I also wrote about laughter, about a small boy who gave me a flower after a speech and said, "You look like a hero," and I kept that dried flower in my drawer because children know things without needing proof. And one afternoon I was reviewing security footage for a press briefing when an email came through from an old name I had not seen in years. It was from Kayla, a childhood friend who had moved away after high school, and she wrote, "I saw the news and I wanted to say I believe you and I wish I had spoken up sooner," and it surprised me how much that meant because even late belief still carries weight, and I replied, "Thank you, I understand, and I hope you are doing well," and we exchanged a few messages, and that was it, but it reminded me that healing comes in strange shapes and unexpected timelines, and in the weeks that followed Marcus's trial became a national headline, and I chose not to attend the hearings in person. I gave my testimony via video deposition, because I had already faced him once, and I did not need to do it again to prove anything to myself, and the court proceedings were not dramatic. Evidence was too clear, and when the verdict came through guilty on all counts, I did not celebrate. I just sat quietly and let out a long breath because justice is not a cheer. It is an exhale, and Lena refused to testify. She cited medical issues, but the court ordered her to relinquish all ties to the Foundation, and I watched her press conference later where she wore dark glasses and gave a carefully worded statement about needing privacy and reflection, and I turned it off halfway through because the performance no longer mattered to me, and a week later I visited the grave of my grandfather. I brought a single white rose, and I stood there under the cloudy sky, and I said, "I hope I made you proud, and I hope I made myself proud too." And I left the rose on the stone and walked away without looking back, because closure is not about standing still, it is about knowing when to move forward. And one morning, Dr. Reid called and said, "I want you to speak at the National Trauma Recovery Summit," and my first instinct was to say no because public speaking still made my stomach twist. But she said, "They need to hear you," and I said yes, and I spent 2 weeks writing and rewriting, and on the day of Summit I stood in front of 500 people in a ballroom and told my story again, not with tears but with steadiness, and when I finished the applause was quiet at first, then it grew louder, and a man from the back row stood and clapped, and others followed, and I realized they were not clapping pain, they were clapping for survival. And after the summit I returned to my apartment and took off my shoes and sat on the floor and let the silence hold me, and that night I dreamt of water, of floating, of being carried, and when I woke up I was smiling, and the next morning I opened my calendar and saw that the Foundation's new education program was launching, and I arrived early to help set up and saw kids lining up with their parents holding hands and laughing, and a girl around 10 years old looked at me and said, "Are you the lady from the video?" And I said yes, and she said, "My mom says you are a warrior," and I knelt down and said, "Your mom is right, and so are you," and she smiled like she believed it, and I hoped she would carry that belief forever. And I stood at the edge of the school gym as music played and balloons bounced in the air, and I thought about all the moments that tried to break me and how none of them succeeded because I had something stronger than fear. I had truth, and the truth had set me free, not in a moment, not in a flash, but in a slow, steady climb, and every step mattered, every breath counted, and I would keep going as long as I had a voice to speak and a hand to reach out, because survival is not just a story, it is a responsibility, and I was ready to carry it. The summer heat settled in with a kind of heaviness that reminded me of the nights when I used to lie awake listening for footsteps outside my door, but now that weight was replaced with something else, the quiet pressure of responsibility, of being seen as a symbol when I never asked to be one. The Foundation expanded with new volunteers arriving each week, some fresh out of college, others with years of nonprofit experience, and I trained them not just in policy and procedure, but in listening and recognizing the signs that often go unnoticed, and we hosted a workshop for teachers on how to respond when a student shows fear without words, and one teacher broke down in tears halfway through the session because she realized a boy in her class had been showing signs for months, and no one had noticed, and that moment stuck with me because it proved that change starts not with grand speeches, but with awareness. And one afternoon as I left the office, my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize, and when I answered, a woman's voice introduced herself as Detective Ramirez from a nearby precinct, and she said I have a question about someone who used to work here, and she mentioned Marcus's name, and my chest tightened, and I said yes, he used to be part of the family business, but he is no longer affiliated, and she paused, and then said we are looking into a separate incident unrelated to your case, but he listed your foundation on a job application, and something about her tone made it clear there was more she could not say, and I thanked her and hung up and stared at the screen for a long time, and I knew I had no obligation to dig further, but my gut told me there were more layers to Marcus than anyone had uncovered, and I opened the security files from years past and saw records of times he had been caught harassing staff or stealing petty cash, and it had all been swept away by Lena's interventions or quiet settlements, and I wondered how many warnings had been ignored not just by my mother, but by others who chose to look the other way, and that night I wrote a policy draft for mandatory background checks for all board members regardless of family ties, and I sent it to the legal team and told them if we are going to preach accountability, we must practice it too, and they approved it without hesitation, and the next board meeting was tense because several of the older members were uncomfortable with how much had changed, and one of them, a man named Elliot, who had known my grandfather for decades, said, "You are turning this place into a fortress," and I said, "No, I am turning it into a sanctuary. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then perhaps it is time to rethink your position," and he left before the meeting ended and resigned a week later, and I did not regret it, and I began speaking at universities, not as a motivational speaker, but as someone who had lived through the silence and could now describe it, and students would line up afterward, not just to thank me, but to share their own stories, and I listened to every single one because I remembered what it felt like to be unheard. And at one university, a girl slipped me a note with nothing but an address, and I gave it to campus security, and later found out it led to the arrest of a professor who had been exploiting students for years, and that moment reminded me that bravery does not always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like writing 6 numbers on a piece of paper and trusting someone to care, and the foundation began receiving national recognition, and with it came invitations to conferences, to awards, galas, to political events, but I only attended those where the mission remained the focus and not the fame, and one evening I stood on a stage to accept a Civic Integrity Award, and as I looked into the audience I saw people from every chapter of my life: Dr. Reed, my old principal, a nurse from the hospital, and even my former neighbor who used to bring casseroles when I came home with bruises, and I realized then that healing is not just about mending wounds. It is about forming new connections in place of broken ones, and after the ceremony I walked outside alone and watched the city lights flicker against the night sky, and I thought about Marcus and Lena, and how neither of them had ever truly looked up to see the light, only the shadow they cast, and I promised myself I would never forget what it felt like to step out from under that shadow. And in the weeks that followed, the foundation launched its new survivor outreach app, which allowed users to anonymously access resources, counselors, and emergency contacts. And within the first month, over 10,000 downloads were recorded, and feedback poured in from users saying it had saved their lives or their siblings or their friends, and I kept every message printed and stored in a box labeled proof. And I found myself waking up without dread, without that cold pit in my stomach that used to greet me every morning, and instead I woke up with plans, meetings, community visits, and more importantly, peace. And one day I received a handwritten letter in blue ink addressed simply to the girl who spoke, and it was from a woman in her 70s who said she had never told anyone what her brother had done to her when she was 12, and that my story gave her the courage to write it down for the first time in over 60 years. And I held that letter against my chest and wept, because time does not erase pain, but truth can soften it. And I knew then that my voice had done more than clear my own path. It had helped illuminate the way for others, and I did not need to be a hero or a warrior or a saint. I just needed to remain honest and open and grounded in the reason I had started speaking in the first place, because silence had once nearly killed me, and now sound had become my survival, and I would continue to use it not for applause, but for impact, because that is what real strength looks like. And as The leaves began to change, and the city shifted into fall. I looked around the office at the new interns, the familiar faces, the growing walls of photos and letters, and I saw not just a workplace, but a testament to what happens when one story dares to be told, and I smiled to myself and whispered, "Thank you to the girl. I once was the one who did not give up." The days moved quickly, now filled with structure and purpose, but even with the progress there were moments when memory returned, not with pain, but with the weight of what I had survived, and one of those moments came unexpectedly during a school visit where I had been invited to speak not just to the students but also to a panel of parents about how to recognize emotional abuse within their own homes. And as I stood there watching the students file in with their backpacks and quiet laughter, I felt a strange mix of strength and sadness, because I remembered myself sitting in those same plastic chairs years ago, hiding pain under long sleeves and fake smiles, and the auditorium lights were too bright, but I kept my gaze steady as I told my story, beginning not with the violence, but with the silence that followed it, and I spoke slowly, letting each word land without apology, and the room was still, so still that even my breath felt loud, and when I finished, I looked up and saw that one mother in the front row was crying, and her daughter reached out to hold her hand, and in that moment, I realized how many families carry invisible wounds, and how sometimes all it takes to break that cycle is one moment of recognition. And afterward, as I was packing up, a girl approached me, her voice trembling as she said, "I think my brother is hurting my sister," and no one believes her, and I crouched down and told her that believing someone is the first step, and I gave her my card and told her to have her sister contact me, and within a week the foundation had begun working with that family, connecting them with legal support and counseling. And as the case unfolded, it was revealed that the brother had been mirroring behavior he had witnessed in their own home, and that opened another investigation into the parents, and for the first time that family began to rebuild itself, not on denial, but on truth. And I knew then that our work was not only about stopping abusers, but about preventing the cycle from continuing. And the following month we hosted our first survivor retreat, a weekend program where young women could gather in safety and share their stories through art, writing, and guided therapy. And I remember walking into the main lodge and seeing a wall covered with paintings, some full of color, others just shadows and lines, but all of them powerful and honest. And one girl, who had not spoken a single word since she arrived, handed me her drawing of a shattered house with one window glowing yellow, and I asked what it meant, and she whispered that the window was hope, and I felt my chest tighten with pride and grief all at once, because I knew how long it took to find that light. And on the final night of the retreat, we lit candles and floated them in the lake, each flame carrying a promise to ourselves and each other that silence would no longer be our prison. And when the weekend ended and they boarded their buses back home, I stood alone on the dock for a long time, watching ripples where the light had been and reminding myself that healing is not an end point. It is a practice, and I returned to the city with new fire in my chest, ready to expand the foundation into more schools, more communities, and more hearts that needed to be heard. And around that time I received an email from a familiar address, my cousin Lee, someone I had not seen since we were children, and she wrote that she had watched my interview online and cried, not just because she was proud, but because it helped her remember something. She had buried a memory of Marcus cornering her in the basement during a family gathering, and she had never told anyone until now, and she wanted to ask if it was too late to speak, and I wrote back, "No, it is never too late," and we met for coffee, and she told me everything through tears and long silences, and afterwards she said she felt as if a weight had been lifted, and a week later she filed her own report and more names came forward, and what began as a trickle became a tide, and Marcus was now facing multiple cases, not just mine and Lena's, but from people who had never felt safe until someone else went first. And I realized then that courage is contagious, and so is honesty. And as I walked through the office one evening, turning off lights and locking doors, I paused in front of a framed photo of the first protest. We held my face, young and furious, in the center, and I smiled, not because I missed that version of myself, but because I was thankful for her for not staying quiet. and for believing that change could begin with one voice, and I turned off the final switch and stepped into the night where the air was crisp and the city hummed, and I let it carry me home. The day I received the letter from Marcus began like any other with a quiet morning routine, a warm cup of tea, and the sunlight spilling in through the kitchen window in soft golden lines across the counter. And as I sat sorting through the mail, my fingers paused on an envelope with no return address, and my stomach sank before I even opened it, because something about the handwriting made my breath catch in my throat. And when I finally tore it open and unfolded, the page inside my hands shook as I read his name at the bottom, and I forced myself to keep reading word after word, because this was not a prank, this was not a nightmare, this was real, and Marcus had written to me from the correctional facility where he was now serving time, and the words were short but heavy, filled with guilt and awkward honesty, and he wrote that he had started therapy, and for the first time he had said out loud what he had done to me, and he admitted it without excuses, without justification, just plain ugly truth. And he said he had seen my face in his dreams every night since, and that what he once buried now screamed inside his head, and that while he knew it would never undo the pain, he hoped that his confession would bring me something, anything, even the smallest kind of peace. And when I finished reading, I sat motionless, staring at the letter for what felt like hours, until I folded it back up and placed it in the drawer beside my bed, not out of hatred, not out of forgiveness, but because I needed to decide what to do with it later. And in the days that followed, the words echoed in my mind, and I found myself remembering moments I had buried like ash under years of silence, like how I would hide in the closet when I heard footsteps upstairs, or how I flinched at loud voices, and how I never once cried when the bones in my chest screamed with pain. And yet all that time no one asked if I was okay, because they had decided long ago that the future of a boy mattered more than the truth of a girl. And I thought about how much it took for him to admit it, and yet how little it changed the past, and part of me felt a strange weight lift, not because he deserved anything from me, but because I had already let go long ago. And in the middle of that week I received a phone call from a producer at a publishing house who had seen my interviews and foundation work, and they asked if I would consider writing a memoir. And at first I hesitated, because opening old wounds for strangers to read felt terrifying. But then I thought about the thousands of girls I had spoken to over the years who never found the words to describe what happened to them, and I realized that if I told my story fully in my own words, then maybe one of them would see herself in it and feel less alone. And so I said yes, and began the long process of writing the book from the first whisper to the last confrontation. And I wrote it all the way it happened, no filters, no drama, just raw and real and honest. And the process was exhausting and painful, but it also gave me clarity. And as I typed page after page, I saw myself from the outside, and for the first time I understood that surviving was never about being brave. It was about being stubborn enough to keep breathing when the world made you feel invisible. And when the book was finally published in 2021, the response stunned me. Letters flooded in from survivors, teachers, parents, and even men who said the book opened their eyes. And one letter in particular stopped me cold, because it was from a teenage boy who said he found the book in his school library, and after reading it he realized how cruel he had been to his sister when she tried to tell someone what their cousin had done. And he wrote that he had cried for the first time in years, and he apologized to her, and they were going to therapy together now. And when I finished reading, I broke down in tears, because that is what healing looks like, not courtroom victories or dramatic confrontations, but quiet moments where people choose to do better. And in the months that followed, the foundation grew beyond anything I imagined. We opened new offices, trained more advocates, and began offering scholarships to young women pursuing social work and advocacy careers. And one day, while visiting our Chicago branch, I stepped into a training room where a guest speaker was addressing a group of new interns, and I froze, because standing at the front of the room in a navy blazer and confident smile Was Lena the same girl who had once stood trembling in my office years ago, and now she was leading and teaching and changing lives, and when she finished her talk and saw me, she rushed over, and we embraced tightly, and she told me she was in law school now, and wanted to specialize in cases of abuse. And I told her she already was changing the system, and that her voice would echo for generations. And as we stood there side by side, I realized that survival is not just about escaping the past, but building something stronger in its place. And in the following months, I continued my work speaking across the country, mentoring young survivors, collaborating with lawmakers on stronger protections. And then one morning, I received a legal update stating that Marcus had entered a formal guilty plea and would be serving 8 years, and I did not attend the sentencing hearing because I had no desire to see him again, and because my justice had never been about courtrooms, it had always been about reclaiming my life on my own terms. And that evening, instead of sitting in silence, I led a workshop for high school girls, teaching them how to recognize manipulation and how to protect their voices. And afterward, a girl came up to me and said her uncle made her uncomfortable, but no one in her family listened. And I told her I believed her, and we talked about steps she could take. And as she walked away, I knew she would not carry her pain alone, and that was what mattered. And later that week, I lit a candle on my windowsill, as I often did on nights when the memories returned, and I watched the small flame dance in the dark, steady, unshaken, bold. And I whispered to myself, we are still here, we are not broken, we are louder than ever. And I knew with full certainty that everything I had endured, every bruise, every silence, every ignored plea had not been in vain, because I had turned my pain into something unbreakable. And even as the world kept spinning with new headlines and old wounds, I remained committed, because for every girl like me who was told to stay quiet, there are now dozens who will learn to speak. And that is how we win, not with noise, but with truth, not with revenge, but with rebuilding. And as I closed my eyes that night, I saw the faces of every girl I had helped, and every woman who had found her voice, and I slept not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as someone who had taken back her name and built something beautiful from the ashes. After the book's release and the growing recognition that followed, I found myself at a turning point where the past no longer controlled my present, but instead quietly shaped the work I chose to do. And as the weeks passed with interviews, lectures, and support group sessions, my days became full yet grounded by the knowledge that healing was never meant to be rushed. And one afternoon, while reviewing grant applications for the foundation, I received an email from an old college friend named Trish, someone I had not spoken to since before everything changed, and she wrote that she had read my book and could not stop crying, and she had known something was wrong back then, but did not have the words or courage to ask. And she asked if we could meet, and I hesitated at first, because revisiting those years often reopened wounds, but something about her message felt sincere, so I agreed, and we met at a quiet coffee shop near the old campus. And when I walked in and saw her waiting there with the same nervous smile from all those years ago, I felt a strange wave of comfort and sadness. And as we talked, she told me about her own silent battles growing up, how shame silenced her too, and how reading my words made her feel less broken and more understood. And we sat there for hours unraveling the things we had buried for so long. And in that moment, I realized how many people carried their own hidden bruises, and how connection was not built on perfection, but on honesty. And Tricia began volunteering with the foundation shortly after, helping us build outreach programs for schools. And it was her idea to start a podcast where survivors could share their stories, anonymously giving voice to those still too afraid to speak in public. And the podcast launched quietly with only a few listeners at first. But slowly and steadily, the numbers grew as more people found comfort in the words of others, and it became clear that this was more than just a project, it was a lifeline. And one night we received a voice message from a woman in her 60s who had never told anyone about what her stepbrother did to her when she was a teenager, and she said that hearing other women speak made her feel like she was not crazy or alone. And she cried on the recording, not out of pain, but relief. And we aired her message with her permission, and it became one of the most shared episodes in the series. And from that point on, more women and men began to speak, and I realized then that stories are how we survive, not just by telling them, but by hearing them and believing them. And during this time, I was also approached by a university in Washington, D.C., inviting me to deliver a keynote address at their annual Symposium on Trauma Recovery and Social Justice, and I accepted and spent weeks preparing because I wanted to use that platform to remind people that justice is not only about punishment, but about repair and restoration. And when the day arrived, I stood before hundreds of students, faculty, and mental health professionals and shared not only my story, but the stories of others who trusted me with their pain. And I spoke of a system that often failed to see girls as worth protecting, and of families that chose silence over truth. And I told them that the most radical thing we can do is believe survivors without demanding. They bleed for our sympathy. And when I finished, the standing ovation lasted so long, I had to wipe my eyes and step off stage, and afterward students lined up just to say thank you and share parts of their own experiences. And one young man said he had never realized how much he carried until he heard my words, and now he wanted to start a support group on campus for male survivors. And I hugged him and told him that courage does not look the same for everyone, and sometimes it is just deciding to stay another day. And later that year, I traveled to 6 more cities, delivering similar talks, meeting survivors from all walks of life, some who spoke openly, others who just held my hand and nodded, and I carried each of their stories with me like threads in a tapestry I never asked to weave, and yet felt honored to hold. And back home, I spent more time with Ava, who was now a teenager, curious, strong, and wildly creative. And one night as we sat together on the porch, she asked me why I do what I do, and I looked at her and said, because if someone had done it when I was your age, maybe things would have been different. And she held my hand and said, I am glad you do. And I told her that her voice matters more than she knows, and I watched her smile. And in that moment, I felt a kind of peace that words could not explain. And a few weeks later, we hosted a community event at the center, a celebration of survival, resilience, and art, and people from all over the state came to hear poetry, music, and stories, and survivors displayed paintings and journals and photographs, and the energy in the room was electric, not heavy, not sad, but vibrant and alive. And I stood on stage and thanked everyone for trusting us with their truths, and I said that we are not defined by what was done to us, but by how we rise. And when the applause ended, I looked around and knew this was only the beginning. And that night as I walked home, I passed a mural painted on the side of a building, one I had never noticed before. And it showed a young girl standing in the rain holding a broken umbrella. Above her the words read, she learned to dance between the drops. And I stopped and stared, because that was it, that was the whole journey, not avoiding the storm, but learning to move through it without losing yourself. And I thought of the girl. I used to be silent, scared, convinced that pain would be my only inheritance, and now here I was, not healed, not whole, but standing strong and loud and free. And as I unlocked my door and stepped inside, I whispered to that younger version of me, you made it, and you never have to be afraid again. The night before the court hearing I barely slept, and it was not because of fear anymore, but because of everything I had been holding back for so many years was finally about to come out in a place where it mattered, and I sat in the living room staring at the ceiling until the light from window shifted from moonlight to dawn, and I could hear the birds beginning their usual morning songs, but nothing about that day felt usual or calm, and I got dressed slowly, choosing clothes that felt more like armor than fabric. And when I looked in the mirror, I did not see a broken girl anymore. I saw someone who had been bruised, crushed, gaslit, and ignored, but who was still standing, and I reminded myself that my voice was going to echo in that courtroom. And I was not going to lower it for anyone, not even for the mother who tried to silence me, or the brother who thought his future was more important than my bones. And Ava hugged me tight before I left and said she was proud of me. And it was in that moment I knew that even if the world did not care what happened to me, I had already won something more important. I had shown my daughter what strength looked like, and as I walked into the courthouse, every step felt heavier than the last, because I could feel the weight of years pushing against my back like shadows that did not want to be dragged into the light. But I walked forward anyway, and when I entered the courtroom and saw my brother seated there in a suit, pretending to be boy everyone once adored, I felt no fear, only clarity, and my mother was there too, sitting beside him with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the floor, and I did not look at her again because I knew her silence had spoken loud enough over the years, and when it was my turn to testify, I stood up, took the oath, and walked slowly to the witness stand, and I could feel the eyes on me, the judge, the lawyers, the jurors, even strangers sitting in the back. But I did not shrink, I did not tremble, I looked straight ahead and told them everything, not just the moment my ribs broke under my brother's fists, but the years of silence that followed, the lies that protected him, the pressure to forget and move on the nights I woke up gasping from dreams where I was still trapped in that house, and the echo of my mother's whisper telling me to stay quiet because he had a future, and I told how it felt to be 13 and realize that your pain was less important than your brother's reputation, how it felt to beg for help and be told to pretend nothing happened, and I did not cry because I had cried all those tears already in hospital rooms and in silence behind closed doors, and after I finished the room stayed quiet for a long moment, as if even the air was holding its breath, and then the prosecutor nodded and the judge thanked me, and I stepped down feeling lighter than I had in years. And during cross-examination, the defense tried to twist my words, suggesting that maybe I had exaggerated, maybe I had remembered it wrong, maybe I was confused, but I held my ground and said no, I remember every detail, and if I could forget, I would, but this is not a story I chose to carry, it is one that was branded into me. And the doctor who treated me took the stand next, and his words were clinical but clear, and he confirmed the medical evidence: broken ribs, severe bruising and timing that matched my statement. And when asked if it could have been an accident, he said no, the injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma from deliberate impact. And I watched the jury as they heard those words, and I saw something shift in their expressions, as if they finally understood that this was not a sibling squabble or a misunderstanding, this was abuse. And my mother was called to the stand, and I listened as she avoided direct answers, danced around the truth, and tried to protect the image of a family that never really existed. And when asked if she remembered what she told me at the hospital, she said she did not, and the prosecutor asked her if she thought her son had a future worth protecting more than her daughter's safety. And she said nothing, and that silence was louder than any admission, and the trial continued with closing statements where the prosecutor reminded the jury that this was not just about broken bones, but about broken trust, broken protection, and broken silence, and that justice was not about punishing a boy, but about acknowledging what he did. And defense tried to paint him as a confused teen who made a mistake, who had changed, who was remorseful, but no apology ever came from his mouth. And when the jury left to deliberate, I sat outside the courtroom feeling like time had stretched into something endless, and Ava held my hand while Tricia sat beside me, whispering that no matter what happened, I had already done the impossible. And when the jury returned and the judge read the verdict, I did not breathe. And then I heard the word guilty, and my body let go of a tension I had carried for so long. I forgot what it felt like to sit without it. And I looked at my brother, and he looked back at me with something that was not anger or regret, but shock, as if he never thought I would make it this far, as if he had truly believed I would always stay quiet. And my mother did not meet my eyes, and that was fine, because I was not looking for her approval anymore. And when we left the courtroom, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement, but I felt no fear of those shadows anymore, and I stood on the courthouse steps, closed my eyes, and felt the air on my face, and I knew that justice is never perfect, it cannot undo what was done, but it can create space for something new, and I had finally carved that space with my voice, my truth, and my refusal to disappear. And that night I took Ava out to dinner, not to celebrate the verdict, but to celebrate survival, and we laughed over pasta. And she told me she wanted to write a book one day, and I said you should, and she said maybe I will write your story, and I told her you already are, by living in a world where girls like you can speak without being silenced. And I watched her smile and knew that the cycle had been broken, not just in court, but in blood and bone and spirit, and I went to bed that night, and for the first time in years I slept without waking once, and in the morning I did not feel afraid. The house was quieter after the court hearing, but not because peace had returned. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm when everything feels too still, and you know the damage has already been done, and I walked from room to room unable to settle in one place, the walls holding memory that pressed in on me like weight I could not throw off, and I kept replaying the moment the judge ruled in my favor, not for revenge, but for justice, for something real to stand on after so many years of pretending nothing had happened, and the decision echoed in my ears, your injuries are not self-inflicted, your story is consistent with long-term abuse, and that sentence had shattered the lie my family had lived in, and Mom had cried not because she was sorry, but because it was public and people knew now, and my brother had sat there stone-faced like he had never done anything wrong, like he was the victim of a smear campaign, and Dad never looked at me once. And when it was over and the gavel fell, I felt hollow, not happy, not vindicated, just tired, like I had run a marathon on broken legs. And I went home not to celebrate, but to breathe alone without their eyes watching me with disappointment or disgust, and I sat on the floor of my bedroom and let myself cry in the open for the first time in years, no pillow to muffle the sound, no shame to make me hide, and I thought about all the things they had tried to protect my brother from: consequences, accountability, reality, and I thought about little girl I used to be, the one who stood at the edge of the stairs trying to decide if telling the truth was worth it, and how I had chosen silence more times than I could count, and how that silence had rotted something inside me, something that had only started healing when I spoke out. And I remembered the moment in 2010 when my ribs cracked under his weight, and Mom told me not to make noise, and Dad said it was an accident, and my brother said I was exaggerating, and I believed them because believing them was easier than believing I was alone in a house full of people. And the therapist I saw after the hearing told me that kind of betrayal cuts deeper than the bruises because it changes how you see love and trust and safety, and it takes years to untangle those wires. And I nodded because I knew she was right, and I told her how I still flinched when someone touched my back unexpectedly, and how I hated surprises, and how I checked the locks 3 times before bed, not because of outside threats, but because of what I had lived with inside the walls of what others called home. And she asked me what justice felt like, and I told her it felt like walking barefoot on gravel. Painful but real and grounding, and she smiled like she understood, and I asked her if I would ever stop looking over my shoulder, and she said maybe not, but I would learn how to look ahead more often, and that was enough for now. And I started writing again, not to publish, not to share, but to reclaim my voice on paper and my words. And I wrote letters I would never send to my brother, to my mother, to my father, and I burned them in the sink, one by one, watching the smoke carry away the parts of me that still begged for their approval. And I changed my phone number and blocked every contact except a few friends who had stood by me, and I moved to a smaller apartment, one with no creaky stairs and no dark corners, and I painted the walls light yellow, even though I had always preferred blue because yellow made the space feel warmer, like morning light through open windows. And I adopted a cat, a great tabby with a bent ear, and named her Mercy because it was the one thing I had been denied, and the one thing I wanted to learn to give myself. And I started walking every evening down the same street where I used to ride my bike before everything went wrong, and I let the air fill my lungs without fear, without having to watch for sudden movements or angry voices. And one night I passed a family laughing on their porch, and I did not feel envy, only distance, like I was watching a movie from the sidewalk. And I was okay with that because healing does not mean erasing, it means making space for both pain and the possibility. And one day I saw my brother on the news, not for something bad, but for winning an award for his work in tech, and I stared at the screen and felt nothing, not rage, not jealousy, not sadness, just the absence of feeling. And I turned the TV off and went back to reading, and that was the moment I knew I was finally free, because he could exist in the world, and I did not have to carry the weight of him anymore. And I made tea and sat by the window and thought about all the versions of me that had survived to bring me here: the girl who hid under beds, the teenager who wrapped her own ribs, the woman who sat in a courtroom and told the truth. And I whispered thank you to each of them, and let the silence be soft, this time not empty, but full of the life I had built piece by piece out of everything they tried to break. There was no final chapter to what happened, no single moment that marked the end. Instead, it became a long, slow unfolding, where every step forward was a choice, and every quiet moment without fear was a victory. And in the months after the trial, I rebuilt my world, not all at once, but piece by piece, choosing carefully what to keep and what to leave behind. And I stopped checking my family's social media, stopped trying to decode their posts or wonder if they missed me or regretted anything, and I realized they never would, and that realization did not break me the way I thought it would. Instead, it made space in my chest for other things, for peace, for clarity, for the strange quiet strength that comes from surviving something no one thought you would talk about. And I went back to school, not for anyone else but for me. I picked a program in trauma counseling because I wanted to understand what had happened to me and maybe one day help someone else understand their own story. And the classroom was hard at first. I had not been in school since 2010, and sitting still made my bones itch, but the more I studied, the more I saw how textbook it all had been: the denial, the favoritism, protection of the abuser at the expense of the victim. And it made me angry, but it also gave me language, gave me tools, gave me a way to explain it all that did not end in shame. And I started sharing pieces of my story in safe spaces, support groups, online forums, places where women and men spoke freely about what they had endured and how they were finding their way back to themselves. And each time I told it, the story felt less like a wound and more like a scar, something that had closed, something that no longer bled. And one night, I got a message from a girl who said she had heard me speak at a campus event and that my story helped her leave a violent relationship. And I cried when I read it, not out of sadness, but out of awe that my pain had become something useful, something that could reach across time and help someone else take a step toward freedom. And I started volunteering at a shelter every weekend, helping women file restraining orders, find housing, apply for jobs, and sometimes just sit with them in silence, because sometimes that was all they needed, someone to witness their fear without judgment. And I found purpose there, not in fixing anyone, but in being present. And one evening after a group session, a woman asked me if I had forgiven my brother, and I sat with that question for a long time before answering. And I told her that forgiveness was not the goal for me, not then, maybe not ever, because forgiveness did not mean pretending it never happened, and it did not mean reconnecting. It meant releasing myself from the hold he had on me, and I was still learning how to do that. And she nodded like she understood, and we sat there watching the sun go down through the wire mesh windows, and I felt something shift inside me, not an answer, but a quiet acceptance that healing was not a line you crossed, it was a circle you walked over and over until it stopped feeling like a prison and started feeling like a path. And I went home that night and wrote in my journal for the first time in weeks, and I wrote, "I survived, and that is enough." And I read it aloud to myself because hearing it made it more real. And I started seeing a new therapist, not because the old one was bad, but because I was in a new chapter and needed a new lens, and this one was quieter, more reserved. But she asked good questions like, what does safety feel like in your body? And what do you want to do with the rest of your life? And I told her I wanted to write a book, not for fame or money, but to give voice to the girls like me who had been told to stay quiet and protect the future of the boy who hurt them. And she said that was a good reason to write, and I started drafting chapters late at night when the world was still and I could hear my own thoughts. And I told the story from the beginning, not skipping the hard parts, not making anyone look better than they were, just the truth, plain and raw and honest. And I sent a few chapters to a friend who worked in publishing, and she said it was powerful, said it needed to be read. And I cried again because the girl who once hid bruises under sweatshirts was now putting her truth on paper for strangers to see. And I did not feel afraid, I felt proud. And I went on a date for the first time in years with someone kind and quiet who asked before touching my hand and who listened more than he spoke. And when I told him a small part of my story, he did not flinch. He just nodded and said, "Thank you for trusting me." And we kept it slow, and I liked that because there was no rush, no pressure, just two people getting to know each other one piece at a time. One morning I woke up next to him and felt safe, not just with him, but with myself, and I smiled because that was something I never thought I would feel again. And I visited a bookstore downtown and saw a woman with a young girl, and they were laughing and choosing books together, and I watched them a minute and felt something warm in my chest, not longing, not pain, just warmth, and I knew then that I was okay, really okay, not pretending, not surviving, but living. And the bookstore owner asked if I needed help, and I told him I was just looking, and he smiled and said, "Take your time," and I did. I took my time because for the first time in forever time was mine to take, and I went home and added another chapter to my book, and titled it Becoming Whole, and I knew it would not be the last chapter. And that was the best part, because the story was still going, still unfolding, still mine to write. Outro. This story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.